My name is Claire Morrison, and I was 30 seconds away from signing the paperwork for my first business loan when my mother called to tell me she was giving my co-signer funds to my brother instead. I was standing in the parking lot of Meridian Credit Union in Richmond, Virginia, in my best blazer, the one I'd dry cleaned twice because I wanted everything to be right about that day. My phone buzzed against my palm. I almost didn't answer. I almost walked straight through those glass doors and into the life I'd spent 4 years building toward. But I saw her name on the screen and I answered the way I always did immediately, assuming something was wrong. Something was wrong, just not in the way I expected. She didn't ease into it. She never did. "We can't do the cosign today, Claire. Your brother needs us right now. His bar is underwater, and if we don't help him this week, he's going to lose everything." I stood in that parking lot with the sun hitting the hood of my car and the loan officer probably already waiting at her desk inside, and I felt something go very quiet inside my chest. Not sad, not angry, just quiet, the way a room gets quiet when something irreversible has just happened, and everyone knows it. I asked her if she understood what she was saying. I asked her if she remembered that I'd spent 4 years saving, planning, building a client base for my design studio from a corner of my apartment. I asked her if she knew the loan window closed at the end of the week and I'd already used every extension available. She said she knew. She said she was sorry. She said my brother's situation was urgent, that he had employees depending on him, that the timing was terrible, but what could they do? She said I was so capable. She said I'd figure it out. She said those exact words, "You'll figure it out," like they were a compliment instead of a door closing in my face. I hung up and stood there for another full minute. Then I walked inside, told the loan officer there had been a family emergency, rescheduled for a date I wasn't sure I could make work, got back in my car, and drove to my aunt's house on the other side of the city without calling ahead. Before I tell you what I found in my aunt's spare room that changed everything I thought I understood about my family, and what happened when I finally stopped pretending that fine was the same thing as okay, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had someone describe pulling the ground out from under you as them believing in you? Leave that in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one. My aunt opened the door in her gardening clothes and took one look at my face and put the kettle on without saying a word. That's the thing about her. She'd always been the one person in our family who treated my silence like it had weight, like it was worth waiting for instead of filling. She'd never had children of her own, which I think gave her a clarity about other people's kids that my parents had long since lost about me. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. The phone call, the parking lot, the 4 years. She listened the way people do when they already half know the story, nodding slowly, refilling my mug. When I finished, she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "This isn't the first time this family has done this to someone." I looked at her. She looked back. Then she got up, went to the hallway closet, and came back with a shoebox that smelled like cedar and old paper. "Your mother asked me to hold on to some of her things when she moved after college," she said, setting it on the table. "I kept meaning to give it back. I never did. I probably shouldn't have opened it. But I was 30 years old, and I had just watched my future get redirected to my brother's third failing venture in 5 years. And the girl inside me, who had spent her whole life being the capable one, the low-maintenance one, the one who figured things out, she needed to understand where that expectation had been built. There were letters inside, handwritten, folded small, in my mother's unmistakable looping script. They were addressed to my aunt, and dated from when my mother was around 22, 23, roughly the same age I'd been when I first started saving for the studio. I read the first one. "Mom and Dad came to Daniel's opening night but couldn't make it to my gallery showing last month. Mom said she forgot to write it down. I've been in that apartment for 2 years and they've never once visited. They bought Daniel a car for his birthday. They gave me a card with $40 in it. I keep thinking if I achieve enough, they'll eventually look up." I set the letter down. I picked up another one, dated a year later. "I've decided I'm not going to be angry about it anymore. If I ever have kids, I'll make sure both of them feel equally seen. I'm not going to play favorites. I know exactly what it costs." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at my aunt with what I imagine was the specific expression of someone watching 2 separate films suddenly reveal themselves as the same story. "She was you," my aunt said quietly, "before she became them." The drive home was long and dark, and I spent most of it doing the math on things I'd always filed under just the way it is. My brother's DUI at 20, that my parents had quietly paid a lawyer to handle. His first bar that failed and that they refinanced their house for. The way every family vacation had been scheduled around his availability. The way my college graduation dinner had been cut short because he had a thing. The way I'd learned before I hit high school to lead with "I'm fine," because it was easier than waiting to see which direction their attention would turn. I wasn't fine. I had never been fine. I had been efficient. That night, I sat at my apartment desk with my laptop open and my design software minimized behind a blank document. I didn't go live. I didn't call anyone. I just started typing, the way you do when something has been building pressure for long enough that it stops asking permission and just comes out. I wrote about the parking lot. I wrote about the letters. I wrote about the first time I remembered understanding that my brother's needs had a different category in our house than mine did. I was 8 years old, and I'd had a fever of 102, and my mother had spent most of the night on the phone with him because he'd gotten into a fight with his girlfriend in high school and needed her. I wrote about the college savings account that had my name on it for 12 years and then, 2 months before I started my applications, had been partially redirected to cover his community college tuition. Nobody asked me. My father told me afterward that they'd figured I'd find scholarships. I did. That wasn't the point. I wrote for 2 hours, and when I finished, I had something I didn't know what to do with. Not a diary entry, not a complaint. It read like testimony. My best friend had been asking me to start a content account for my design work for years. I'd always said I wasn't ready. That night, I opened a new account on a platform I'd used professionally, but never personally, named it something plain, and posted the piece as a photo essay with simple text slides. No names, no faces. My brother was my brother. My parents were my parents. I was the one who figured it out. I went to sleep, expecting maybe 40 views. I woke up to 4,000, and a notification that the post had been shared by an account with 300,000 followers who had written, "This is the most accurate description of golden child family dynamics I've ever read. Save this." The comments floored me. They came in for days. People describing their own versions of the parking lot, their own versions of the $40 birthday card, their own versions of learning to say "I'm fine" so well, they eventually stopped being able to say anything else. I read every one of them. I responded to more than I had time for. I kept thinking about my mother's letter. If I ever have kids, I'll make sure both of them feel equally seen. I know exactly what it costs. She had known. That was the part I couldn't let go of. She had known what it felt like, and she had done it anyway. And she had presumably told herself some version of a story where that was okay. 2 weeks after the post, my brother called me. He didn't say hello. He said, "Are you the one doing that account?" I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He said, "Claire, I've seen the posts. Mom showed me. You're clearly talking about us. You're making us look like garbage online to strangers, and I want you to know that's a seriously messed up thing to do when I'm already dealing with so much right now." I asked him what he was dealing with. He listed 4 things, all of them financial, all of them consequences of decisions he had made freely, all of them being actively managed by our parents with money and time and emotional labor. I had never once been offered an equivalent measure. I told him I was sorry his bar was struggling. He said that was condescending. I said it wasn't meant to be. He said, "You know this isn't fair. You're posting about personal family stuff. That's private." I thought about my mother in her 20s, writing letters in a dark apartment, about gallery showings her parents didn't attend, about watching her brother get everything she didn't, about promising herself she'd be different. I thought about her deciding, eventually, that different just meant choosing a different child to shine the light on. When it was happening to me, it was also private, I said. And no one posted about that either. They just kept doing it. He hung up. The next call was from my mother. She did not start with "I'm sorry." She started with, "I want to understand what you're trying to accomplish." That's a marketing phrase. My mother has worked in corporate communications for 25 years, and she defaulted to managing the situation language when she felt cornered. I had grown up watching her do it with everyone except my brother, with whom she was just a mother. I told her I wasn't trying to accomplish anything. I told her I was trying to exist somewhere that didn't require me to be smaller than I was. She said I was exaggerating the situation. I asked her to explain the loan. There was a pause. Your brother needed us. I needed you too. That was the entire purpose of the conversation we had 6 months ago when I told you about the studio, and you said you'd co-sign, and we structured the whole application around that. I know. And I'm sorry about the timing. Mom, it wasn't the timing. The timing was a symptom. You have redirected to him every time I have needed something since I was old enough to need anything. I'm not performing victimhood for strangers on the internet. I'm saying out loud, for the first time in 30 years, that this is what happened and it was not okay. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I hadn't expected. She said, "Where did you find the letters?" I told her. Another silence. Longer this time. "I wrote those when I was very young," she said. Her voice had changed. Something in it had gone softer, less managed. I was hurting. "I know. I read them. You knew what this felt like, and you promised yourself you wouldn't do it, and then you did it to me." She didn't argue. That was the most surprising thing. She didn't call it a different thing, or reframe it, or tell me I was misremembering. She just said, quietly, "I know." We stayed on the phone in that silence for a while. I want to pause here, because I know some of you listening are probably thinking, okay, she called you out on an account. Big deal. Is this really worth blowing up your family over? And I want to say, I understand that. I've thought about it too. I've thought about whether going public with private pain is ever truly justified, whether the comfort it gives strangers is worth the cost to the people you share a last name with. I don't have a clean answer. What I have is this. I spent 30 years being quiet about a thing that was real, and the silence didn't protect anyone. It just protected the pattern. My brother texted me a few days later. Not a call, a text, which told me everything I needed to know about how ready he was to actually talk. It said, "I don't get why you're doing this. I haven't done anything to you. I've been dealing with my own stuff my whole life. You think everything was easy for me?" I sat with that for longer than he probably expected. Because here's the thing, and this is the part that took me a while to see he wasn't entirely wrong. His version of our family was just as real as mine. He'd been handed a crown that wasn't earned, propped up by parents who needed one of their children to be exceptional more than they needed both of them to be okay. Every time they rescued him, they also prevented him from ever building the muscles you need to handle your own life. His bar was failing because nobody had ever let him experience a consequence long enough to learn from it. He was 32 years old, and he still called our mother when things got hard the way a teenager calls for a ride home, not because he was lazy, but because that was the only relationship dynamic he'd ever been allowed to have with her. I texted him back. I said, "I know it wasn't easy for you either. I'm not doing this to destroy your life. I'm doing it because I got tired of having no life to protect." He didn't respond for 2 days. When he did, it was just one line. "I didn't know you felt that way." I wrote back, "That's the thing about the quiet kid. You only find out what we're feeling when we stop being quiet." The account kept growing. I kept posting. Still anonymous. Still no names. Still just themes and patterns, and the specific architecture of what it feels like to be the child that gets labeled resilient when what they actually are is neglected in a way that doesn't look like neglect from the outside. A therapist I'd started seeing with some of the freelance money I'd saved reached out through the platform, not for therapy, just to say she was sharing my posts with clients because they described something she'd spent years trying to help people articulate. That was the first time it occurred to me that the words I'd been taught to swallow my whole life were actually useful, not just to me, to people who were still in the middle of their version of it. A month after the parking lot phone call, my father called. My father was not a big caller. He was a man who communicated primarily through the presence or absence of physical things, a full gas tank when you borrowed his car, a grocery bag left at your door, a repair made without being asked. He was not good at words, so when his name appeared on my phone on a Tuesday evening, I felt my stomach drop. "Hey, kid," he said. He always called me that. Not in an affectionate way, in a way that had always felt like a placeholder, like he'd never quite landed on what to actually call me. I said hey back. He cleared his throat. "Your mother showed me what you've been posting." I waited. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I know what you're talking about. I've known for a long time that things weren't, I knew it wasn't equal. I told myself it was just different kids needing different things. I told myself you were the one who didn't need as much. I said, very carefully, I needed exactly as much. I just stopped asking. He made a sound I didn't have a word for. Not quite a sigh. Something heavier. Your mother and I have been talking. Really talking. Maybe for the first time in a few years. About your brother. About you. About how we ended up here. It's not been easy conversations. I asked what he meant by that. He said my mother had told him about her own childhood, in more detail than she ever had before. About her brother, my uncle, who I'd always known as the golden one, the successful one, the one my grandparents beamed about. About what it had cost her. She said she thought she was doing something different with your brother, my father said. She thought if she chose her own kid as the golden one it would feel like fixing something. Like breaking the pattern by controlling which direction it went. I looked out my window at the street below my apartment, at the ordinary Tuesday evening proceeding on the sidewalk. It doesn't work that way, I said. No, he agreed. It really doesn't. He asked if I would come to dinner. He said not to reset anything, not to pretend the last month hadn't happened, just to be in a room together and say the things that needed to be said in person. He said my brother would be there. He said my mother was asking, not as a manipulation, but because she was genuinely lost and genuinely trying to find a direction that wasn't a way. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 days. I talked to my therapist about it. I talked to my aunt about it. I wrote a private journal entry about it that I didn't post. I thought about what it would mean to walk into that house and what version of myself I needed to bring with me if I did not the version that had spent 30 years making herself smaller, but not the version that had spent the last month living in the heat of newly discovered anger either. Something more clear-eyed than both of those. On a Saturday in November, I drove to my parents' house in the suburbs, where I'd grown up, parked on the street instead of the driveway, and sat in my car for 5 minutes looking at the front of the house. It was the same as it had always been. The same sycamore tree my father had planted when my brother was born. The same porch light that stayed on all night because my mother had always been afraid of the dark. A thing I'd known about her since childhood without ever being told, just observed and filed. The same welcome mat that said something cheerful in a font my mother had chosen at a craft store 15 years ago. I knocked instead of using my key. It felt important to mark that line. My mother opened the door. She looked like she'd slept less than usual and was trying hard not to show it. She stepped back and let me in without touching me, which was right. She'd always been the kind of mother who reached for you, and the fact that she didn't this time told me she was trying to read what I needed instead of defaulting to what she wanted to give. My father was in the kitchen. My brother was at the table. My brother looked like himself but reduced. Not broken, not dramatically fallen, just quieter. The confidence that had always filled rooms ahead of him had pulled back a little, like a tide going out. He looked up when I walked in and nodded and said, "Hey," and I said, "Hey," back. And we held eye contact for about 1 second longer than we ever had before. I sat down. I put my hands flat on the table. "I want to go first," I said. Nobody argued. I looked at my mother, and then at my father, and then at my brother, and I said, "I'm not here to relitigate everything that ever happened. I'm not here to make you feel as bad as I felt. I'm here because I spent 30 years believing that my needs were less urgent than the needs of other people in this family, and I need you to understand that wasn't a personality trait. It was something I learned, and I need to know that you understand it wasn't okay." My mother nodded. Her eyes were full. My father said, quietly, that it wasn't okay, that he was sorry for his part in it, which included looking away when he saw it happening. He said he'd been thinking about what it meant to be physically present in a family and still be absent in the ways that mattered, and that he didn't have a defense for it, only an acknowledgement. My brother was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know what was happening was at your expense. I just thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought the way things were was normal. I didn't ask them to treat me differently." "I know," I said. "I know you didn't ask for it, but you also didn't question it. You accepted it as your due, and that's still a choice, even if you made it without knowing all the information." He absorbed that. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But I am." I believed him. That surprised me. My mother told us, then told all of us, not just me, what she'd told my father privately about her own childhood, about her brother, about the specific mathematics of a household where one child is the sun and another is the moon, and the moon is expected to be grateful for the reflected light. She said she'd spent so many years angry about it that somewhere along the way, the anger had warped into a need to be the one who controlled the spotlight instead of being controlled by it, and she'd aimed that spotlight at my brother without understanding that the shadow it cast went somewhere. She said the shadow went somewhere. She looked at me when she said it. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the letter I'd read in my aunt's shoebox. I know exactly what it costs. She had known. She had failed anyway, not from cruelty but from something more complicated than cruelty, from a wound she'd never properly treated, that had organized itself around her without her permission until it became her architecture. I didn't say I forgave her right then. I wasn't ready to, and I wasn't going to say it before I meant it. But I said something else that I think was truer. I said, I understand how you got here. That's not the same as saying it was okay. But I understand it. She covered her mouth with her hand and nodded. We ate dinner. It was my mother's pot roast, the one she made for every significant family moment. And the familiarity of it was strange, in the context of everything else, like a normal backdrop held up in front of an unusual scene. We talked about my studio. Haltingly at first, then more. My father asked questions I hadn't expected him to know, to ask about the loan timeline, about whether the window was truly closed, about what the path forward looked like. My brother, near the end of the meal, said quietly that he wanted to pay back whatever was redirected from my loan with the money he'd get when he sold off the equipment from the bar. I told him he didn't have to do that. He said he knew. He said he wanted to. I left before it got late. My mother walked me to the door, and we stood on the porch in the November cold, not hugging yet, just standing there in the particular silence of two people who have said things that can't be unsaid and are figuring out what comes next. I don't know how to be different, she said. It didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like someone standing at the beginning of a long road and being honest about how far they had to go. I think you start the same way you start anything hard, I said. You just start. She nodded. I walked to my car and I drove home. On the way, I thought about all of it. Not in a spiral. I'd done enough of that in the past month to last me a while. More like taking inventory after a storm. What was still standing? What needed to be rebuilt? What had blown away so completely it wasn't coming back, and whether that was something to grieve or something to make room for. My studio was still possible. Later that week, my aunt offered to be my co-signer instead. She said she'd been waiting for a reason to do something with the money she'd been saving, and as far as she was concerned, backing someone she'd watched build something real from the ground up was a better investment than anything a financial advisor had ever suggested to her. I cried in her kitchen for the second time in a month. But a different kind of crying. The first time had been the kind that comes from exhaustion. This time was the kind that comes from relief being bigger than you expected. The account kept going. I started posting under a real pseudonym, something between anonymous and present. I talked about what it meant to be the child who was called strong, when what was actually meant was, we don't have capacity for your needs right now. I talked about the way families sometimes build their equilibrium on the back of one person's silence and call it harmony. I talked about going to that dinner, and what it felt like to say the thing I'd needed to say in a room that couldn't control me anymore. And to hear imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely, that it had been received. I want to say something to whoever is listening to this right now that I wish someone had said to me a long time ago. Surviving a family that favored someone else over you is not the same as being okay. Being called independent and capable and low maintenance is not the same as being loved well. You are allowed to name what happened to you, even if the people who did it meant well, even if their own histories explain how they got there, even if they're sorry now. Explanation is not the same as erasure. Understanding why something happened does not obligate you to pretend it didn't. And if you are the one who was favored, and some of you listening know exactly who you are, I want to say this as gently and as directly as I know how. The pedestal they put you on cost someone else their floor. You didn't ask for it, but now that you know, you have a choice about what you do with that information. That choice is yours. Before I close this out, I want to ask you 3 things. If you're the one who was always told to figure it out, Told that you're the strong one, told that your needs were less urgent than someone louder in the same house. What's one thing you stopped asking for, that you actually still want? If you were the favored one, do you know it? And what would it mean for you to actually look at the person who stood in your shadow? And if you're the parent, or the future parent, what would it take to love your children equally, not identically, but equally in weight and in witness? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I'll be back next week with the next part of this. There's still more I haven't told you yet about what happened with my brother's bar, and about the message I got from a woman I didn't know who said one of my posts had given her the language to finally talk to her own daughter. But for now, from wherever you are, I just want to say, if you felt something listening to this, if you thought of someone, or remembered something, you filed away under just the way it is, that feeling is real. And real things are worth paying attention to.